Well, good morning, you wonderful people. It's great to see you this weekend. We are these days in a series called 30 Days to Live. And we're imagining if we only had 30 days left to live, what would all of a sudden become highly important to us? What would be top priority in our lives? Now, we're reminded in this series that as wonderful as this life is, the treasure actually that it is still in the framework of eternity very, very brief. Now, we are in our fifth weekend talking about this. You may remember weekend one, we talked about living in the moment. When you and I are living in the moment, we're turning when into now. We're turning our good intentions into actual actions, and we're turning our whole heart toward Jesus. The second weekend, you may remember that Jason talked to us about tending our thought life because we live out what we think. Actually, our whole life is lived out right here and right here. Third weekend, we talked about developing an eternal perspective. And we said if we're going to develop an eternal perspective, we're going to learn to guard against materialism. We are going to become radically generous, and we are going to decide what matters most. Last weekend, Steve talked to us about keeping our priorities intact. Do you remember that great little Bible study we had in Haggai chapter 1 last weekend where God was saying to us with great love and very clearly, give careful thought to your ways. That really summarizes this whole series. If we had 30 days left to live, only 30, we should give very careful thought to our ways. Now, given that we're in our fifth weekend, if you've missed any of the first 4 weekends, you can get on our website and everything's archived on our teaching page on our website, okay? So you can catch up and stay threaded in. Now, reach for your notes if you would. They look like this, or if you are opting for a digital version, you can access those with YouVersion online. And as you're finding that, would you please stand with me? We're going to look at our series verse together, Psalm 39, which reminds us that our human lives, our very experience is but a breath. Do you see it? Let's read it together in a big loud voice. Lord, remind me how brief my time on earth will be. Remind me that my days are numbered, how fleeting my life is. My entire lifetime is just a moment to you. At best, each of us is but a breath. Please be seated. If you will get these 5 words, this sentence, everything that we're going to unpack in today's Bible study is going to make a great deal of sense to you. Here are the 5 words. Life is all about relationships. Let me say that again. Life is all about relationships. Say it with me, everybody. Life is all about relationships. From the earliest pages of the Bible, we understand that God has created us for relationship. And really 2 primary relationships. First of all, our vertical relationship with Him, but secondly, our horizontal relationship with each other. That would also include marriage. It would also include parenting. But you and I were created by God for life-giving, significant, deeply satisfying relationship. And anything short of that will leave us with some sense of a void or a vacuum internally. I don't care how much stuff we acquire or accumulate in this life. I don't care how many accolades we achieve. I don't care how many mountains we climb. I don't care what our bottom line looks like financially. If we don't leave the earth with our relationships intact, we will leave this earth probably with one of the worst of all human emotions, regret. Regret. Remember what God said last week in Haggai chapter 1. Give careful thought to your ways. I would insert, let's together give careful thought to our relationships. So if God has created us for relationship with Him and with each other, that would explain to you why we talk often around this place that we exist. Our mission is loving God, loving people. Now, what are God's thoughts on relationships? There's a key verse. I want you to see with me Ephesians chapter 4. Check it out. Paul writes, always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowances for each other's faults. Have you noticed that everybody that you genuinely care about has faults? Why do we do this? Because of love. We make every effort to keep ourselves united in the Spirit, binding ourselves together with peace. You and I are created by God for relationship. Let me show you what I mean. So over here, we have a couple bowls, and I want you to think of these bowls as your life, okay? And my life. And we have two different options for how we're gonna live going forward. And we're gonna put three different components in each of these bowls which represent our lives. We're gonna put in sand, and the sand is the 10,000 things that drive us crazy. The 10,000 things we've got to do all the time. Our to-do lists have to-do lists. We've got all kinds of lists on our smartphones. We're just absolutely huffing and puffing to keep up with all the things that fill our lives, just like these 10,000 grains of sand fill this bowl. Now, the question is, what is left? How much space is really left? There's a couple other things in front of us here. There are some smaller rocks that look like this. You'll notice these are a lot bigger than the granules of sand, so these actually qualify as important things. Not the most important, but important things. The money we make, the jobs that we have, actually our health, those are some important things in our life, but not the most important. We can actually fit a few of these smaller rocks in here, some of the important things in our life. But now we're almost out of room, and we come to this final bowl, and what this represents are the big rocks of the most important things of all. And if I took this whole bowl of the most important things of all, how many am I really going to be able to get in this version of living life? Maybe one or maybe none. Why? Because we're full of other stuff, not bad stuff, just stuff. What if we lived our lives this way? Our life is this empty vessel, this bowl that I hold in my hand. And what if we said, let's give careful thought to our ways. Let me be an individual of discernment and wisdom and understanding and priority, knowing that relationships are the most important thing in life. What if I took the ultimate big rock and put it in first, because that represents relationship with God and with each other? And there's a few other big rocks: our marriage, our parenting, et cetera, et cetera. If we use these things as the foundation, they easily fit. They're not gonna fit in this life, which is well-intentioned, but crammed with stuff, and there is no more room for the most important things. But if we build a foundation with the big rocks of the most important stuff, particularly relationship, we have room for a ton of the small rocks of our work and coaching PTA and teaching kids sports and Thanksgiving meals and all the other things, watching 49er games today. Hey, don't even pray about it. It's only how much we're gonna lose by today. We screwed up when we didn't get Brady in the draft. Okay, so I'm just saying. Okay, so we've got a lot of the little rocks in there that are also the important things, not the most important. But what else do you notice that we can now get in a life, a version of which is constructed with the big rocks at the foundation, the bedrock? We can still get in tons of our to-do list, tons of the busyness of life, most of which is valid, but in terms of eternity, it's not the kind of stuff which is gonna last forever. And I could take this other pitcher full of sand and fill it up as well, and there's still room to get all of these other things in, but not if we do it this way. And I wanted to give us the visual that if we will build our lives from the ground up, a sure foundation. Jesus taught a metaphor about that, didn't he? and we put the big rocks in first, we are positioning our lives for the blessing of God. We are positioning our lives for peace in our relationships. Now, if we're going to be at peace in all of our relationships with our 30 days left to live, we got to do three things. Here's number one, fill it out. We got to learn to talk humbly. Talk humbly. I said in weekend number one, and I say it again, this stuff in this series is very simple, but it's not easy. Because in a relationship that has gone sour, a relationship where you were once deeply close, almost a bosom friend of, a treasured, cherished relationship that has now somehow gone desperately wrong, and there are emotions charged and loaded on both sides, how easy is it really? Be honest now. How easy is it really to talk humbly? It's pretty hard. We want to start hurling stuff and launching Scud missiles and defending ourselves and accusing and attacking and all the things that we human beings do. One of the insights in reference to relationship the Bible teaches that a gentle answer turns away wrath. The way that you neutralize the toxic nature of relationship is listen and talk humbly when it's your turn. Listen and talk humbly. Listen and talk humbly. This is one of the illustrations the Bible uses to help us understand how important it is that our relationships be in a good place. I'm in Matthew 5. I've listed it there for you. Jesus is speaking. He said, hey, if you're even presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Now, let's back up the truck so we understand what's going on in that first sentence. To present a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, often in places or houses or buildings of worship, the front area is called the altar area, okay? It's where people in community come forward, and that's kind of the response to truth and the response to spiritual insight, and it's the time of personal application of spiritual truth at the altar. It's the time of prayer for each other, and we're going to do that at the end of this morning's Bible study. Jesus said, even if you come to the altar and you're actually bringing a sacrifice to God, like a gift, some statement of something you're giving to the Lord to demonstrate your love for Him, Jesus says, don't even give it till we do something first. Okay, got that? Go back to the verse. Check it out, still in Matthew 5. And you suddenly remember that someone has something against you. Now notice what it doesn't say. Jesus does not say, you suddenly remember that you have something against someone. No. This is you suddenly remember that someone has something against you. Now, look at me, everybody. We know. We do. We know. We know when somebody has something against us. We're not going to argue about the legitimacy of that they may have against us, how valid it is, et cetera, et cetera. But we all know it takes two. To make peace, it takes two to have animosity and angst in relationship. Jesus said, before you give me your gift at the altar, and you remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice at that altar, go and be reconciled to that person, and then come and offer your sacrifice to me. Jesus wants us to go to that person because love goes first, and to talk humbly. You know what it takes? It takes courage. It takes humility. I have learned in my journey, stumbling and bumbling along the way of trying to become a fully devoted Christ follower, I have learned that there's going to be a regular item on the spiritual menu for those that legitimately want to grow up in God, okay? You listening? It's called humble pie. Have any of you ever eaten humble pie? Because if you haven't, you're not initiating reconciliation in relationship as you remember somebody that has something against you. Humble pie. It's this simple. We cannot be right with God if we're wrong with people. We can't offer a gift at the altar of God to the Lord himself if there is angst and pain and woundedness, bitterness, hostility, resentment in our hearts toward another human being. Again, we cannot be right with God if we're wrong with people. So first of all, we talk humbly, remembering that a gentle answer turns away wrath, remembering what Jesus said yet again in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will see the kingdom of heaven. Are you a maker of peace, a peacemaker? Are you a healer and a reconciler? Or are you kind of just plowing through life, kind of striking out, and you wonder why people are avoiding you? You wonder why there's so much animosity in so many different quarters of your life. You and I have to make the decision, do we want to be right or do we want to make peace? Usually we cannot have both. That's the first thing we learn. And again, simple, not easy. Secondly, here's the second thing we got to do to have peace in relationships, and it's this: love deeply. In 1 Peter chapter 4, the Bible says, most important of all, continue to show deep love for each other. And then a very interesting tag on the end: for love covers over a multitude of sins. Jesus said at another time, the one that's forgiven much will love much. Check out 1 Peter 4 one more time. Most important of all, show deep love for each other. Now, notice not just love, deep love. Do you know what deep love is? The actual Greek word there in 1 Peter 4 is the word ektaino. It means to stretch or to extend. Do you know where we got that term? We got it from Greek athletes in the very first Olympiads, when these runners in a marathon, another Greek term from the Olympic era, would be stretching and reaching in their exhaustion at the end of the race, stretching and reaching for the finish line. What Peter is saying there, inspired of the Holy Spirit to us today, trying to have peace and relationship in the 21st century, he's saying if you're going to love deeply, you've got to begin to stretch yourself toward other people and put yourself in a place of discomfort. So far, we're uncomfortable twice. We're uncomfortable to talk humbly when we'd rather give people a piece of our mind. We're uncomfortable again because now we're stretching and reaching to love this other person that at least may in the moment be quite unlovable. I mean, honestly, they're a pain. And ektaino says, no, you stretch, you reach. Our default setting is shallow love. Somebody hurts our owie boo-boo and we say, hey, you're no longer in the circle of trust. Hey, you can no longer be my friend. I'm no longer your friend. You hurt me. You were mean to me. That kind of shallow love is so often what suffices for love. It is not love. There's a whole new definition of love that Jesus gives. When we talk about the biblical kind of deep love, here it is. If you'll get your arms around this understanding, it'll give you a whole new dimension in all of your relationships. The agape love of God, which is the highest and ultimate form of love, is an unconditional commitment to an imperfect person. Not conditional commitment, unconditional commitment. Conditional commitment says, as long as you make me happy, as long as you serve me, as long as you do what I want, then I will bless you by my choosing to stay in this relationship. That's not love. That's conditional. That's about rules keeping. That's about gamesmanship. That's about keeping score. That's about legalism. This is unconditional commitment. That's what a vow is. Marriages in our culture today are still trucking along, give or take, at about a 50% divorce rate. Because when the warm glow and blush of first love is gone, and when stars and moonlight become diapers and dishes, and the stress of bills and schedules and year after year after year and all the push and pull. I don't feel love anymore. That has absolutely no bearing on commitment whatsoever. A commitment is a commitment is a commitment. Ride out your period of low feelings, and the good feelings will return eventually. Because good feelings always follow the correct actions. So even when you're not feeling loving toward another human being, act in ways toward them that are loving. And very soon you'll find that your feelings will catch up with your actions. In other words, we love or we act our way through the low spots of relationship till the blush and the thrill and the excitement and the warmth returns again in our hearts. An unconditional commitment to what? A very imperfect person. Imperfect person, flawed. They will hurt you. They will be selfish. There will be things that you discover that you never imagined in 1,000 years could be so in this relationship. See, it's the kind of love God models, an unconditional commitment to an imperfect person. Third thing, as we move to a wrap today, and that is to forgive completely. We're talking humbly. We're loving deeply. We're forgiving completely. You say, John, is it really this simple? Again, I said it's simple, at least at a surface level. This stuff is hard to actually live out. But God always gives us grace when we're moving toward obedience. This is the biblical teaching on how to restore, to reconcile, and give life again to frayed, broken relationships. Notice Colossians 3. Make allowance for each other's faults. Forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Do you notice there at the end of that Colossians passage, which I've included for you, it says, so you must forgive others. That word must in Greek is the command. It is a command. It's not like an option. It's God saying, if you are mine, the greatest demonstration to our culture, to our world, that you're legitimately one of my own, God would say to us, is that you have a love that endures and a love that forgives. I command you to forgive one another as I have forgiven you. Some of you have been abused, you've been hurt, you've been violated, you've been slandered, you've been gossiped about. Even then? Yeah, even then. Now, as a balanced statement, I'm not talking about enabling. I'm not talking about enabling somebody's criminal or unlawful or cruel, legitimately cruel behavior. I'm talking about in the biggest range of the kinds of disconnects and speed bumps we hit in the normal range of human relationship. It's a stunner for people when they find that even knowing God, things can still go south in relationships. Even being a regular church attender does not in any way exempt us from sometimes making very foolish decisions. I want you to watch this video.
My husband and I met when I was in college. We dated for 5 years. In our early marriage, we just struggled. He worked nights, I worked during the day. I didn't want to say anything to anybody or to him even because I didn't want to be a nagging wife. I didn't want to ruffle any feathers, you know. I wanted everything to just be okay, and I just thought that at some point it would be okay. I was taking our first son to church, and I'm serving in childcare. During that time, I met a friend, and she always asked me how I was doing, and I always said fine, which was not always the case. You know, I was building up this anger and this bitterness towards my husband. I got to a point in our marriage that I felt alone, and I felt like I was a single mom, but I was married, so it was confusing. I left and I took my son, and we were separated for the first time. When I left and we first separated, there was a friend at work that at some point our friendship developed further into more of a relationship, and I ended up having an affair while my husband and I were separated. My husband had filed for divorce. He found out about the affair and was just, he was like, my hands are clean, and so we were going through the process. Anyone that we did end up talking to, until we talked to people from the church, or just looking at our circumstances, he did this, or she did this, or this is how I feel, or he upset me, or whatever. They were just looking at our circumstances and feelings at the time. So if they were my friends, I was justified, and if they were his friends, he was justified. And that was all going on during this time that I was serving in childcare at our church. That friend who led with me in childcare, that kept asking me how everything was, I finally, when she came over to my house one evening and just wanted to pray for me and talk to me, I told her everything, and I thought she would be on my side. I thought that she would understand, and she just said, no, this is not what God wants for you. This is not right. And she wanted to pray for me right there, and I let her. Somebody else in the church had reached out to me and wanted to talk to me, and unbeknownst to me, somebody else in our church had reached out to my husband, and I had no idea. So simultaneously, we were meeting with people from the church, and they were praying over us and talking with us, and they were just really just pointing our eyes to God. We were almost divorced. We almost signed the papers. It was like the next week. My husband texted me, and he said, I just want you to know that I love you, and I forgive you for everything, and I'm not gonna divorce you. And he said, God's not gonna let me divorce you. You're my wife. And if you wanna divorce me, you're gonna have to do it. And I was shocked because I feel like those were the words that I wanted to hear for so long. And I felt the same way, like God just really gave him a heart for forgiveness. From that day, we didn't know how. We knew it wasn't gonna be easy, and that very day we weren't just gonna be lovey-dovey and everything was gonna be perfect. We both just kind of took a leap of faith, and we were just like, okay, God, I don't know what's gonna happen. I don't even know if either one of us is gonna be happy. I don't know if it's gonna work out, but we're literally just trusting you. And that was how he reconciled our relationship.
Let's go a little deeper on forgiveness. I want you to look at your notes, and I want you to write down this biblical reference. We don't have time to read it through. It is probably the most poignant story Jesus tells in the New Testament about forgiveness. It's Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 to 35. Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 to 35. Do yourself a favor and carefully read that through at some point this week before we meet again next weekend, okay? Why should we forgive? And you'll notice I've given you biblical references for each of these points. And again, we haven't got time to go through them. Read each one of these on your own time this week. Why should we forgive? First of all, because God has forgiven us. He requires us to forgive one another. He would say to us that those who are forgiven must themselves forgive others. Why else should we forgive? Well, because resentment doesn't work. If you're a person that resentment is almost sort of second nature to you, it just comes to you. You don't want to be that way. You don't want to be shallow, scorekeeping, hostile, bitter, resentful, but you find yourself just kind of slipping into that default setting. Let me just ask you the question, how's that working out for you? I mean, is it achieving what you are hoping it would achieve for you relationally and emotionally? I think you would agree the answer is no. You say, how do I overcome that, John? With God's help and God's grace. I said it earlier, I say it again, that every time we begin to move toward obedience, God graces us. He will give us grace to do the right thing. But first of all, we gotta wanna. We've gotta move in the direction toward obedience. Why else should we forgive? Well, because we're gonna need forgiveness ourselves in the future. Jesus talked about it in a variety of settings. He said, hey, before you notice the speck in somebody else's eye, remove the log in your own eye. I have, in my 35 years of caring for souls and being a shepherd of souls, I have seen, sadly, a number of times where some of the, I don't think they meant to be this way, but very cocksure of who they were in God, their identity in Jesus. They had kind of an air of spiritual one-upsmanship, whatever you may want to say. And man, when they fell hard. That's why we walk in humility. And when we see a brother or sister that sins, we don't pile on. We're not kicking each other when they're down. The Bible always lays the emphasis when you see a brother or sister sin, restore them. And the image in the Greek in the original language is the bone has been fractured. It's burst through the skin. Reset the broken bone so the healing can begin. That's the visual medical image whenever the Bible talks about when you see somebody else that's had a failure, a moral failure, or whatever. How should we forgive? So those are the three whys. Here's the four hows. Number one, we've got to recognize that we're all imperfect. We've got to get off our high horse. Nobody in this house is a veteran. Nobody's getting A's in everything. Nobody has arrived. If we understand our frailty and the finite nature of our days, that's what 30 Days to Live is all about. We understand that we are very imperfect. And truthfully, if we're genuine human beings, we're doing nothing more each day than growing and learning. Growing and learning. We'll not arrive on this side of eternity. We're growing and learning. How should I forgive? Number two, we've got to relinquish our desire to get even. And that can be a seething cauldron internally. And you've got to give it up. And you say, well, John, how do I give it up? You begin to pray. And when you begin to talk to God about it, some days you might have to do it 6, 8, or 10 times for 2 or 3 days in a row or 2 or 3 weeks in a row. But then there'll come a day where only a time or two do you need to say, God, I'm feeling that resentment again, or I want to exact vengeance. And as we begin to practice biblical truth, as we begin to move toward obedience, incrementally we will begin to realize that all of a sudden we have changed our resentment, our desire for revenge, and we have in its place learned a grace attitude to release. To release. God keeps good books. All the injustices on this side of eternity, relationally otherwise, will be sorted out on that day when all humanity stands before him. He is a just God, a holy God, and he keeps good books. How else should we forgive? Well, we got to respond to the evil with good. I've just got to read you this Luke 27 verse. You're going to say, John, this is outrageous. Nobody can do this. You're right. On our own, we cannot. Because Jesus said, I say to you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Now, time out. Look at me here. When's the last time, honestly, and I'm asking myself first, you did good to the haters? I mean, this last election a week and a half ago, man, you watch it, there's not a lot of good to the haters going on either side of the ledger. I mean, it's just like, I will take you out, and then I'll go have a beer to celebrate. Hallelujah. I mean, Jesus said, no, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. Look at love, do good, bless, and pray. You say, John, life doesn't work this way. You're right. This life doesn't work this way. But when you've begun a relationship with Jesus, you're going to begin to understand that he's the king of an upside-down kingdom. If the rules of our lives on this earth as it is now work this way, when we become a child of God, it becomes like this. He is the king of an upside-down kingdom. Our kingdom of this world says, get revenge. Jesus says, no, love, do good, bless, and pray for. You say, John, I can't do that. If you begin to move toward obedience, he will grace you, he will help you. 1 Corinthians 13:5 says, love keeps no record of wrongs. If you've got detailed records anywhere in your world of the offenses committed against you by another, please go home today and shred them. And just begin to purge and move them out of your life. I just say this with love. You know that I'm sure there's value in social media. As I talk to people, I see people who spend their whole lives ratcheted up because did you know what they said on Facebook? Did you hear what they said on Instagram? Did you? And I mean, they're just ratcheted up. Somebody made a statement, they're out in cyber world, and I just refuse to get involved in that conversation. I want to fill myself with the good stuff, the God stuff, the pure stuff, the right stuff. I'm not going to go low, and I'm not going to be dredging in the swamp of human relationships, but I'm going to take the high path, the high road. And Jesus said, love, do good, bless, and pray for. Here's the fourth reason for how we should forgive: to refocus on God's purpose for our lives. When we have hostility, anger, rage in our hearts, you know what it does? It derails our lives. We're like a train that's got off the track, or the BART trains or whatever. And here's what happened. We're making no more forward progress toward our ultimate vision or purpose or call that God's given us in our life. We're just in this seething cauldron that's been derailed, and the pot's being constantly stirred, and we can stay in that place for decades. What we resist will only persist in our life. If we do not release, we will come to the point that we resemble. You've heard me say this before, that hurt people hurt people. When are we going to break the vicious cycle in our lives that we don't hurt others because we ourselves have been wounded in the past? We've got to break that vicious cycle. And if nothing else would sober us up, maybe this will. Our children are watching us every day. That's not about a guilt trip. That's about the responsibility of parenthood. Don't worry that your kids aren't listening to you. Worry that you're watching you. And the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The habits of forgiveness or not forgiveness that we bear in our lives that are the rule for our homes, you watch. Our sons and daughters will live those out in their marriages and in their homes. Where did they learn them? Whether they be healthy or destructive, they almost always learn them from us. So how do we begin to build a godly legacy? It's a huge part of it is learning to be a gracious forgiver of offense. Now, when we talk about being at peace, we've said we've got to talk humbly, we've got to love deeply, we've got to forgive completely. And when we forgive completely, we're going to find that forgiveness sets the captive free, only to discover the prisoner was me and the prisoner is you. When we forgive, we turn the key and our life is back on the track and we begin making forward progress again, moving forward to our destiny in God. There is in your notes a Make It Personal section of who you might need to forgive, whom you might need to ask forgiveness from, and some specifics about implementing these principles that we're talking about this weekend from the Word of God. Would you take time in your reflection time, your devotional time this week to process that Make It Personal portion of your notes? Stand to your feet with me, everybody, would you please? Let's close with our series verse, Psalm 39, verses 4 and 5. After we read this, by the way, we're going to have a worship song, and we're gonna have a time of prayer. And this is what we're gonna do. Rather than I just lead in prayer from up front, we wanna pray for you. So if you have a prayer need, whatever it may be, as soon as the worship team begins to lead us, I want you to step out from your seat, just walk down. There will be people up in the front area here ready to pray for you. Without judgment, without fault finding, we're just gonna lay hands on you, and in Jesus' name, believe God to help you be at peace in all your relationships. Let's read it together. Lord, remind me how brief my time on earth will be. Remind me that my days are numbered, how fleeting my life is. My entire lifetime is just a moment to you. At best, each of us is but a breath.